Okay, so in this last section, I want to talk about what happens when all of these food scares go global. And since I teach this course in Korea, I like my students to think about the Korean context for these debates. And I've assigned an article by Renee Kim, which looks at one of the largest protests in the history of democratic modern South Korea, which happened in 2008, which was a protest of American beef. And in this article, Kim looks at the many different concerns that shaped these protests, and in particular, the politics of the beef protests around the free trade agreement and how they were communicated through the Korean press. So in 2008, Koreans' response before 2008 to the mad cow crisis abroad was to ban imports from those countries. And in the early 2000s, mad cow was discovered in U.S. beef. And so Korea banned the importation of American beef. And in 2008, the United States and Korea were negotiating a free trade agreement. And among those changes of the free trade agreement would be the importation or the renewed importation of American beef. Now, the politics of this are more complicated, but quickly a variety of groups started to mobilize in reaction against the ruling power party at the time to say that no, we shouldn't do the free trade agreement, and no, we shouldn't be opening ourselves up to American beef importations. And one of the things I try to get to discuss with my Korean students is what is it that mobilized this large population, one of the largest in Korea's history, around this issue of British beef. So as you can see from this image, it was very visible, well covered by the media protest. People who participated came with candles to the central square at the city hall in Seoul. And so you could visually see people's dissatisfaction with the new agreement. And there were a variety of interests that showed up there. One of them was general political negative feelings about the free trade agreement. The idea that it's unfair for Korean workers, and in particular Korean farmers, to suddenly have open competition with other farmers. In the context of the beef industry, the Korean farmers were concerned about they could not scale up the way that Americans or Chinese or other countries could scale up, but suddenly if they're selling on the same market, that this competition would cause them to go out of business. They argued that they were therefore subject to the lower standards of other countries. When I asked my students, many of my students either were at these protests or their parents were at these protests, and the concern about beef was also central. One student told me she went with her mother, and her mother was concerned about having her daughter eat this beef that might be contaminated with mad cow. And so this concern about the risk standards in another country suddenly being imported and imposed on people in this country were an important influence. But you also had other people showing up there. So other groups were showing up to protest the government, just simply unhappy with this government being out of touch with the public. The farmers organized to show that they were concerned about unfair competition with others, but also about the government not protecting them. And the media coverage was also important. This was the beginning of a new kind of media, including online media created by individual users who were loading up onto social networks. And so suddenly the kind of coverage was on the ground, and that made the movement look different and more democratic. And I would argue that these kinds of street protests, in addition to the new media consequences, are very powerful and effective in politics because of what E.P. Thompson has called the moral economy of the crowd. Just having these large number of people taking the time to show up creates a problem for the ruling power, and they have to say, how do we disperse this crowd? In E.P. Thompson's study in the medieval period in England, dispersing the crowd was a literal violent concern. Do we use force? Can we use force against them? And they had a kind of it became a tactic for the lower classes to enact their political will, and even a kind of rational concern about food pricing. In the context of Korea, the government could not deny dissatisfaction of its voters. It was clear from these images that voters were unhappy, and this could have a problem. But again, how much of this is a story about meat and safety and mad cow, and how much of this is a story about democracy and political mobilization or the local political conditions in Korea? How much of this is a kind of undefined nationalism? Koreans can be very patriotic about Korean beef being superior and being better, and they might equally be patriotic in thinking that other countries' beef therefore doesn't fit the standards. Is that in fact the case, or is this just a kind of nativist patriotism? The resolution in Korea reinforced this kind of nativist sense about quality and origin, because the solution was origin labeling. And so for all meats that come into Korea now, they have to put the location of where that beef comes from. And what you've noticed, the result is that much of the beef of middle quality that is sold at cafeterias and in restaurants is Australian beef, because they're a big mass producer in this region. And then Korean beef now is incredibly expensive and is sold as high commodity product in supermarkets for steaks and such. And the last article is my own. And one of the things that all of these articles had in common with Jasanoff's, Kim's, and my own is that the authors are writing amidst the scandal. And so in 2012 and 2013, suddenly Europe was facing this scandal about the discovery of horse meat in beef. And there was an interesting familiarity to how it evolved, sort of rapidly expanding into new product lines and being found as more of a systemic problem. It was interesting because of cultural things. Is horse meat in fact contamination? It's not like mad cow, which is clearly a disease. Horse meat is an actual edible substance. And I was approached by a magazine to write about this, and it puts you in this interesting position because I had to make predictions about how this debate evolved. And so in all of the articles, I encourage you to read them thinking about how the authors address this crisis in evolution. How are they making predictions? How are they trying to make connections across this crisis and previous ones to sort of make sense of it? The way I tried to make sense of it was thinking about how this is not really a new thing. The journalism around the horse meat scandal was sensational, and it was also very short-sighted. A lot of the authors wrote in this mode of, oh my God, this is happening, I can't believe this. And in fact, to me, it seemed very familiar and not surprising. And so I started to write this article from the point of view of what are the familiar recurring themes in this scandal that look like these other scandals that food scholars like myself have seen before. One is this perception of a crisis spiraling out of control. Now, this took several forms in the journalism. Journalists complained about how regulatory agencies didn't seem to be getting ahead of food safety, but instead were constantly putting out fires, what you could call whack-a-mole regulation, like the game where you're whacking the mole. Instead, they're always responding instead of being progressive or getting ahead of it. Once again, it illustrated how food scares and food scandals are very rarely localized, because the food chain is now globalized, particularly in the European Union. Initially, the horse meat was discovered in genetic testings of beef in the UK. And so initially it looked like it was going to be a United Kingdom debate, but very quickly tests done in other countries in Europe found that, in fact, yes, the European Union is a single market. And so it was spreading across borders because food moves across borders. Now, this was particularly true of Britain, but another aspect of this that I think got less attention but was important is how risk stratifies across the market. And what I mean by stratifies is that the risk that you're eating some food that is dangerous, or in this case undesirable, is greater in markets that are where regulatory controls or quality controls are lower. So initially, all of the beef found to be contaminated with horse meat were in products that were clearly mass-produced, sold in supermarkets for poor consumers or less affluent consumers. In the United Kingdom, the reaction to food safety has very much been centered around supermarkets, and so there's a kind of geography of supermarkets. If it's sold at Waitrose, for affluent consumers, it's seen to be better controlled, and so you wouldn't be at risk of something like this. If you go to a cheaper place, a Tesco or others, then there's more of a risk. And again, I return to this question, what is meat? Because if you're selling one cut of steak, you know that is coming from one cow. And that changes your traceability or your supply chain analysis going backwards from a contamination. You know that it comes from one animal. But with ground beef, or in this case ground meat, it could come potentially from hundreds of animals. And so it wasn't that they were finding that this was 100% horse meat. They were finding it was some percentage of horse meat. And it reminds us that with this large-scale grinding of meat, you're mixing together a wide variety of sources, and that is a different kind of regulatory challenge in terms of tracing back. And it opens you up to this possibility that some of the meat is not, in fact, beef. And finally, and this is a quite old lesson, but fraud is a continued problem in all food markets, and anxiety about fraud is a sort of central feature of food supply. Now, there are new dimensions of this which might change this in the future. DNA testing for products. Also, there are efforts to make traceability through barcodes or new surveillance techniques that follow food components all the way through the food chain. This may, in fact, change it in the future. I particularly think product testing is a big one. Imagine if all consumers had something where they could test the product in the moment and know it does or does not have horse meat. That would put a different kind of pressure on these fraudulent practices. But the conclusion of the article I was trying to get across is that even with these measures to get ahead of this in the future, I was predicting we will have another food crisis in a year or two. It will look dramatic. It will be eventually solved, just like I was sure that the horsemeat scandal would eventually pass away, and it would go into the background of our minds, and the biggest thing that would happen is that we would have this sense of unease. And Lethuan and Schneider wrote an article in 2012 where they talk about the restless consumer. And they say that even with all the information we're getting, all of these measures from regulatory agencies or NGOs to inform the consumer and to give us options, including opting out of unsafe food, it doesn't reassure us. It makes us restless. It gives us this sense that it makes us aware of failures in the food supply. And I saw this as a kind of fundamental feature of modern food production. Now, the other interesting thing about the horsemeat scare is horsemeat is not, in fact, toxic, right? And you would see these smug editorials where people would talk about how, for some people, horsemeat is, in fact, a delicacy. And if you buy high-quality horsemeat like a steak, it arguably has more nutrition, and a certain kind of person finds the flavor very attractive. In many of the European countries, particularly on the continent, it is an expensive product. Now, this is a bit of a distraction for a couple of reasons. First of all, the horses being sold and being found in this Horsemeat scandal are not being raised for meat, and this is important. When you raise an animal for meat consumption, it has to be regulated in terms of what chemicals can be used on it. When you raise it for racing, you might have growth hormones and other kinds of hormones used to make it a competitive horse racer. And the economic context of this scandal was that the breeding of horses for racing had become economically bad, and many people who bred horses for that market were suddenly trying to unload them onto meat providers at cheap levels, and so this is why they were not selling the horse meat. They were trying to hide it with beef. These kinds of horses might potentially be contaminated with inedible food products. The other reason why it's a bit of a dodge is because it's insensitive. Some people genuinely find eating horse meat disgusting. And even if it is cultural and not biological, we have to ask the question, do they have a right to that, to know about this? It's a question we can also ask in the context of the genetically modified food debates. It's a question that comes up here in Korea because of the dog meat market, and so I want to put this slide in at the end here to return to this question of what is meat. What is it about us in the West that we find disgusting that in certain countries they eat animals like dogs? What makes a certain kind of animal appropriate for meat eating and another not? We have rational justifications we give for this, and there's a tendency culturally for people to want animals to specialize. So for example, in Taiwan, it's not that eating beef is taboo for cultural reasons, but it's taboo because it's uncommon because the cow is a labor animal. And you could argue that similarly horses are used in ways that aren't for eating that then compete and make us uncomfortable with eating them. And similarly, we can be sentimental about dogs because we see them as pets. However, in Korea, certain types of dogs aren't seen to be pets. They're seen to be a kind of source for a special sort of meat that has health benefits in their culture. So this gets to a question about cross-cultural sensitivity or insensitivity. Should Westerners just get over it, let Koreans eat their dog meat? Should we impose our own cultural norms about how that's inappropriate? And how do we justify that? The reverse is also true. In 2015, the U.S. ambassador was attacked by a Korean who was later found to be insane. And advocates of dog meat showed up to wish the ambassador well and to say, hey, we want you to get healthy. And they brought dog meat soup with them as a kind of gift. And this was embarrassing to many Koreans because the ambassador was a well-known dog lover, and it was seen to be kind of insensitive of these Koreans to be imposing the dog meat eating on the Americans who they knew did not like this. And these kinds of cross-cultural insensitivities, I think, are something we need to be aware of and to try to avoid. So, to sum up, for questions that I would like you to consider on this class, I want you to think about what it is about food scares that is particularly upsetting and generates social mobilization and social unrest. What is the role in scale in shaping this new anxiety about food and consumers' restlessness? How has scaling up meat given us new anxieties and also new risks for meat? And then, is urbanization changing our relationship to meat production? Think back to the utopia. When we move meat production to the peripheries and we forget how meat is produced, does that then make us sentimental about animals? Does it change our understandings about our own food supply in ways that we should think about and criticize? Okay, thank you.